Good morning, everyone. I'm Haiko, Director of New Order Fashion, and this is Wool Talks here at Dutch Design Week. This might be your first day, but we have been going through these conversations in the past few days already, so we've learned a lot about wool. Of course, wool is a material that we are investigating in this year's exhibition program. Every day we bring experts to the panel to learn about different perspectives when it comes to wool and the regenerative potential together. Today I have a panel of experts that will tell us all about certifications, standards, regulations, new business models, so we can go a bit technical today. If there's anything you want to know more about or something is unclear, feel free to raise your hand. We have a microphone and we'll try to clarify as much as we can as we go through the conversation. Every day we put a different perspective at center stage. Today it's about changing the industry. Multiple elements need to come together to truly see change when it comes to material use, factory standards, and overall emissions of the industry. That's what we are investigating today in the context of wool. And for today, the question is, how can certifications, standards, policy, and new business models drive the fashion industry towards a more sustainable and regenerative future? So, without further ado, I think it's time to introduce my panelists. Here, Lonneke de Kort from Control Union. Welcome to the panel. Could you, in a few sentences, explain who you are and what your role is?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Haiko. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. For me, it's the first time in the Dutch Design Week, although I've been in fashion for 30 years. My name is Lonneke de Kort. I'm heading the textile business unit for Control Union. Control Union is a global player in certification for food, feed, biofuels, coffee, tea, but also for textiles. And that's also my domain. And really joining here to discuss, and we already had a nice start in the conversation on how standards and certification could help. Our role is actually to assess and verify the compliance of company, farm, supply chain and brands towards the standards that we are accredited for. And that's our role. I think this is also a bit why I'm here to support in the discussion.
I think a lot of interesting hooks we can dive into a bit more, but before we do, Stijntje Jaspers, Fibershed Netherlands.
Yes.
Could you explain also in a few sentences what that entails?
Also, thank you for inviting me. Good to be here with both of you. I'm Stijntje Jaspers, one of the founders of Fibershed Netherlands. Fibershed Netherlands is a regional value network, part of a global fibershed movement of 70 fibersheds all over the world, of which 15 are in Europe. Actually, what we all do, we look in our own bioregion, what do we have and what can we grow in natural materials for textiles. But the materials we should grow in a regenerative way. They should add to biodiversity, healthy soil, clean water, etc. Also social, so community-based. And then we try to process them as local as possible into textiles and clothing of a high standard. But also they should be able to biodegrade at the end of a long circle. So maybe, thank you. We can maybe show the circle that helps. And the value network contains of all kind of companies and businesses and startups and initiatives that play a part in the circle. So these are farmers, processors, designers, makers, producers, but also us as the wearer and the user. We play a role in the circle. We're not outside of it. Circular economy, next to the user. It's also included the circular economy, because I get a lot of questions like, you do natural materials, we do circular, and I then think, how circular do you want it to be when it can go back into the soil?
So we all do the same, but sometimes it might have been difficult, and that's why adding the circular strategies made a lot of...
Yeah, and I also, in the beginning, I got a question, but when I have a nice woolen sweater, isn't it a waste? I put it in my garden. I said, yes, of course, that's a waste. You should first do all the steps, like repair and use it for long, and then at the end of a very long life and recycling, etc., then when you can't do anything with it, it can go back into the soil for the next crop.
Yeah, so that's also the regenerative values that we also try to see in the designs that we work with here with the talents.
Yep.
I think it's a nice link. Before we get into more details, Janine Roling, collectief Circular Textiles. Could you explain in a few sentences what the initiative is about that you're involved with?
Yes, definitely. I'm very happy to be here. I am the co-founder of Collective Circular Textile, and trying to keep it very short, we are actually a producer responsibility organization, and that means that for a piece of legislation called Extended Producer Responsibility, which basically makes producers of textiles responsible for the life cycle of their products. So there's targets in the Dutch legislation, and a lot of producers cannot reach those targets by themselves. Therefore, we have set up a Collective Circular Textile. On behalf of those producers, we try to reach those targets. And I think what makes us different, because there's multiple of these organizations, but we really try to take more of an ecosystem perspective. So we take the legislation as a starting point, but we really try to look, okay, what else can we do? So we, for example, also have a collaboration with Fibershed to really see, okay, how do we incorporate alternative business models? How can we focus more on natural materials? Those are all things that are not necessarily in this legislation, but we do feel that it's important to focus on it. So that's the approach we take at CCT. It's very much impact driven.
It hints towards the role of policy making and EPR schemes and all those technical terms that we'll dive into a bit more. What we've learned so far is that system change, going from a linear to a circular system or to a regenerative system, it has many moving elements that all have to move together. It's very difficult to plan it out in a roadmap. So I was thinking with the question, like, should we start with policy, should we start with standards, or should we start with new business models? I think it doesn't really matter because all are equally important here. But now that you already have the microphone, Janine, maybe it's good to just start with policy and the role of national European policy in changes this industry, because we have this linear system, wasteful, large scale, and we want to bend it towards a future that is more regenerative and circular. What's the role of policy in that transition?
What we see is that policy is actually very important. If you look at it from change theory, it is important to have the circular business models, the examples. It's also very important for policymakers, because one of the first things they will ask is, but is this possible in practice? If you can showcase that something is possible in practice, it's easier to get the legislation implemented. At the same time, without legislation, we see that the scale up of circular initiatives is not going fast enough. We have a lot of great circular initiatives that are smaller, but if you want to take a business, a textile producer with a linear business model that has earned money for a very long period of time with this linear business model, sometimes they make tweaks. They will do a little bit of greenwashing here and there, and then they say, oh, it's great. But to really make them change the way that they produce, the way that they design their products, you need legislation. There needs to be an element that forces them to make a change, because at the end, if we talk to the sustainability manager, these people have great intentions. They want to do good. But if you take it to the boardroom, it's about money. The way the economic system is built nowadays, it doesn't prioritize circularity. So the business model at this moment, circular business models will be more expensive. And without legislation, the economic incentive to become circular is not there. So we need the legislation to really scale up circular initiatives, create the enabling environment for those businesses to thrive. And then we will also see that the bigger businesses will be forced to become more circular. So I think that without legislation, it's going to be very difficult.
This clear enabling role for creating the conditions in which circularity and regeneration gets a fair chance at succeeding and competing. A few days ago, we spoke about how activist movements drive cultural narrative, influence politics, and then policymakers will then think about regulation that can change textile waste, for example. How do you look at the national versus the European level at policymaking and that dynamic?
I think specifically with the extended producer responsibility legislation, the Netherlands was quite early to implement it, earlier than the European level, which was good. We only had it in France, now we have it in the Netherlands, and it will become mandatory in all EU member states around 2028. But for the most part, if we talk to Dutch policymakers and politicians, they will say it's easier to wait for Europe. It is true that especially the policymakers that work on the EU level, the Netherlands is known for pushing European legislation to become more ambitious, but it's definitely not the case that within national legislation we are extremely progressive and we do great things. And one thing to also add to what I said before, sometimes what we see is that environmental legislation can be quite ambitious. We can have good environmental policies, progressive economic policies. The circular transition will also not happen. The holistic approach to legislation is still missing.
Yeah. The social element in the circular economy with living wages and the fact that circular business models require more manual work, so they're thus more labor intensive, and that maybe there's also something to be said about the price of resources compared to the price of labor might shift in a circular future.
Progressive taxation.
Yeah. And there's so much interesting things to connect to from this point in the conversation, I think, because like earlier this morning there was this article in the news that the Dutch government kind of lost their influence compared to previous governments at the European Commission level. That does say something about being progressive as a country will also mean that we have to have strong policy makers that are acting with vision and really driving this industry forward. So I think that's something interesting to keep in mind in the next few weeks. But for the rest of the panelists, I can imagine that this policy is more of a top-down effect on the industry. From your perspective, it's way more the grassroots, the bottom-up initiatives that are driving the transition, if I'm correct.
Yes, but I think that's also what Janine said, that you do need all these steps. So when you have a system change, it starts with the front runners and the pioneers. And then from this experience, you can then influence the policymakers like it is possible. Look, it's already happening. And we need also, of course, the activists and the NGOs, etc. And we need the public and the financial sector. You need all these steps. But a lot of times it starts with the grassroots activism from people, civilians like us, and also from startups or little companies or initiatives that think, hey, this can be different. How can we do it different? And I think it's a pollination effect, like one pollinates the other and then it goes back. In the textile legislation in Europe, they ask inputs from the companies. The only problem we face is that the bigger the company, the more money they have, the more influence they can have on the legislation. A lot of these companies are very much linear driven and also a lot of times oil-based synthetic materials, which are cheap and easy to produce.
Well established and represent over 60% of the world fibers consumption.
Yeah, it's really difficult for bigger companies that work with natural materials to have influence. That's why Fibershed is part of Make the Label Count, a collective of companies that work with natural materials for textiles. And so then we have one seat at the table, which presents a lot of companies, instead of each company having a seat. We're trying to push back. Pioneers try to show the route or try to see, can we do it differently? And then we have the legislation. And to get also the bigger companies active, because yes, it's about money and profits, and they have KPIs which are not at all supporting this change. But we also have to be careful that the legislation is not going to kill the pioneers. That's why we try to work together, because the legislation is very much to get the companies that are already there to move. But the pioneers who are already doing it, sometimes it's difficult for them.
Yeah. And I think this is a nice segue to Lonneke. What you're working with at Control Union is, of course, maybe also translating the legislation into systems that can help to audit and account for compliance, but maybe also bottom up that there are initiatives in the sector that people think, hey, we do something so different, we really want to have it standardized and certified. How does certification relate to this topic of policy and legislation?
Certification bodies don't make policies. We check compliance in the market of all the farmers, the manufacturers and the brands. Legislation and certification are not the same. They need to adhere to legislation, always goes on top of the standard. So when there is national legislation, really something saying about living wages, then this will be the one that actually need to be complied with the standard requirements. And this is how it works. What we see, and there is one more thing I want to relate to the big brands, to what extent they have effect. H&M is one of the accounts that I'm personally working with because of their effect. And the buying power of these big brands is enormous. We have the pioneers who set the path, but if the big brands don't adhere to this, then they make the change. They drive also the supply chain to move in a certain direction. H&M, with their buying power, have 100% preferred materials. Yes, also the viscose, but everything they do is what is responsible fibers is actually certified. This means, and that's the strength of certification, it's bringing a framework and a common language that we can all understand and have a certain checkup. If you're certified for standard X, then comply with A, B, C, and D. And that also gives a trust into the system to what extent you can call something sustainable. And certification, for example, the responsible wool standard is related to the farm level, and then it moves in traceability. So when the supply chain use it, we only check if indeed the material that is claimed as sustainable or responsible moves along the supply chain. Yeah. I think that's important to realize. The big brands cover 60% of the market. With this, they have the power. 2 examples, regenerative. You have a number of schemes that are related to regenerative. For example, Regenagri. Regenagri is embraced by PVH. That's the mother company of Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein, as well as Inditex, which is the mother company of Zara, Bershka, name them all. By pushing this, they have an influence till farmer level, because there it starts. If you don't have raw materials, then you cannot certify anything. And this really pushes the supply chain to move faster. Yes, they are a monster, but at the other end, they can work for us. They have leverage, and I think if you really want to make the change, you need legislation, and that's the second point that I want to bring into. The reason why these big brands have why legislation works, because they are the one, and in Dutch it's called hoge bomen vangen veel wind, and this means something like, if you are out in the open, you will actually be the one also taken to be into account. You are accountable for things. They have actually departments who work into legislation. They are very afraid because they need to report to their shareholders what kind of efforts they did, the CSDR, the CD, DDD, all these kind of things, and the digital product passport. So they're really putting efforts to it. Then, last but not least, a nice example of how from the bottom onwards something can change into standards and then finally, I guess, in legislation. Italy is one of the next countries implementing the EPR. There is right now a consortium of 215 brands covering Louis Vuitton, Valentino, Armani, really the high-end brands that say something about recycled materials. Because for now, recycled materials, and it's not related to wool, is something you can only use if it otherwise would go into waste stream. But the reality is, during production, you also have waste. Noise, you have scraps, but this is not seen as waste. But it's a loss. It's 10%. At least average. This is not covered by GRS. So what we did, I was in the Textile Exchange conference, we will now have a discussion together with the consortium, together with Textile Exchange, to see that we can finally leverage this waste during production not to be seen as eco-efficiency, but actually allowing this to be reclaimed material, moving into a certain efficiency. And no, it's not circularity. Circularity is a difficult cookie, especially in the linear driven companies. But these are all examples how legislation, certification brings change as well.
Trying to put pieces of the puzzle together and design new pieces that can fit where previously there was no piece that could fit that. There's also the GRS, Global Recycling Standard, which is very common in your washing labels, for example. And the EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, maybe also good to give a bit of clarification. That is the new legislation that's in effect in the Netherlands and also the European level.
France, Italy.
Yeah, and that requires manufacturers and this company that sells the garment to take it back. The difference in what's being sold and what's being taken back for recycling, that is being charged with an additional fee, if I understand it.
Yeah.
You might do a better job, but okay, I tried. And the responsible wool standard, this is something I think people in the audience that might have seen different talks this week. Yesterday we spoke about ethical factors and animal welfare. Textile Exchange is our storytelling partner with one of the works in the exhibition, so they are working hard on this responsible wool standard. Yesterday, the thing I took away is that it's super difficult to have ethical wool in the current industry. I would want to know what initiatives we might have missed in terms of certifications focusing on animal rights and that are doing something different there.
Yeah, it's a challenging one. What we just discussed a bit. Certification is not a holy grail. It's just allowing us to have a framework to talk about something and to at least make little steps. Standards are never complete. It's not going to solve everything. What we see from standard perspective, the responsible wool standard will evolve into the material matter standard. That's a big change, what will be coming up. And the big change is related to moving, instead of verification of a X percentage in a certain material and at farm level, for example, for wool related to animal welfare, but also the social compliance, into a standard that is really driving impact, so that farmers are responsible to start reporting about soil health, biodiversity, and everything belonging to it. So we're actually going to look into a broader framework than we did. Does that then lead to more ethical wool? That's a good question. I don't know. But at least it's taking into account that we need to move into a bigger picture. The challenge, and that's what we discussed as well, that means there will be more pressure on the farmers because we need to check more. That means more cost for certification. And as long as there is no premium paid for it, what will it bring? And I think that's one of the big challenges we have to see, how we could move beyond this and find a solution.
There's something I would want to ask about the general process of certification, also to get a clear understanding how it works. But before we do, it's probably good to elaborate a little on the pressure elsewhere in the value chain. Because when legislation gets introduced and certification gets introduced, it doesn't always end up in the place with the company that with the most buying power, the most leverage, the most resources to make the change. It's often elsewhere in the value chain.
Can I also answer about the ethical wool question? If you look at regenerative agriculture, and if you look at, we're also looking at how did we do it more than 100 years ago. A lot of farms had crops, but also had animals. To have healthy soil and loose soil, you need animals. So we cannot go without the animals. We have too many now, and we keep them in not right circumstances. We eat too much meat, but it's not that, because a lot of things like wool is not vegan. No, that's true, but vegan is a lot of times with plastic. So what is better? And then if we talk about the local supply chains, in a lot of Fibershed countries in Europe, but also in the United States, there is a lot of wool that we don't use at the moment because we have sheep for meat and for milk and cheese. You can have an opinion about that, but they have to be sheared because if we don't shear them, it's really not good for the animal. So there is this wool, which is a waste product. In the past, this was sold to China. They could not even pay the shearers with it, but at least it went to China. China didn't want it anymore, so now it is burned, etc. A lot of initiatives, a lot of them part of Fibershed, are trying to give value back to this wool because it's a very valuable product. And if you can, and then people say, yeah, it's too hard to make a pullover. Sometimes it is, but you can also make nice wall hangings or insulation or fertilizers. There is a lot of value to be given to the wool. Then next to that, we have the heat sheeps, which are on the dikes and in the heath, and they actually keep the nature in a good place. So in the Netherlands, we have only a few little farms who have sheep for their wool. Then they have merino sheep, or this is from the Nitwit stable. It's from Angora goat, which is called mohair. And then, of course, they try to keep them as good as possible without any antibiotics. It is possible to have ethical wool. There are a lot of legislations in Australia and New Zealand where a lot of wool is coming from. The issue is also that we want too much. We consume too much, we buy too much, we produce too much, we eat too much. It's too much of everything. And that's why we need monocultures, we need intensive agriculture, and we think that is better because it produces a lot. But we also now see that it ruined a lot. So I think it's also about diversification, regenerative agriculture, but also about consuming less, buying less, and then have better products. And then this will also help the animal welfare. If you don't need all the sheep to be packed together, but keep them in a nice, good way, then we can have really nice products. And the value of the products will also go up because it's not about a cheap product, but it's about buying a product with a story which added positively to the nature. Because I don't know if you all know it, but wool has a very bad LCA's life cycle analysis.
Like the impact calculation on CO2 footprint, on methane emissions. Yeah.
And then the LCAs feed into the product environmental footprint, which they are now trying to get in Europe, which is a very good initiative because we will get a label on the clothing like the Nutri-score in the supermarket. At least you get some verified information about how good or bad the product is. The only thing is, that's a problem now, it is going from data from the intensive system. The PEF originated from measuring refrigerators and car tires, so that's all mechanical. textile is a very complicated group because it has natural materials and man-made materials. Anyway, I can talk for hours about PEF, so I won't do that. But I want to say that it is important that all this legislation at least give all types of product a fair chance. And at the moment, it's not doing that.
Yeah.
And then one legislation like the PEF could be used as modifier for the EPR. A lot of people are talking about it. It could go into other legislation, and then the whole natural material is gone, because at the moment in the current PEF system, a polyester acrylic pullover made in Bangladesh for 10 euros is better for the environment than this nice pullover made in the Netherlands, local, regenerative, etc.
Yeah.
If you think about it in a logical way, this is really strange. Also, if we're moving from energy transition to fossil-free, if we look at the bioeconomy policies of the European Union, that it needs to be more green and more bio-inclusive. And then in textiles, we're going to say, let's use oil and chemicals. And
Janine, I'm also very curious, because this ties back together with what you started with in our conversation, and it's this seat at the table. And I have the feeling that as long as these regenerative, smaller scale initiatives aren't having a proper seat at the table, we will see these impact calculations that will favor synthetic fiber use over local wool that might even be a leftover product from other industries. Is that also what you're seeing? And if that's what you're seeing, how do you think we can work towards a more fair seat at the table for those initiatives?
It's a very good question. I think that maybe a lot of people don't know that big brands, big textile producers have full-time lobbyists within the European Parliament. They are there all the time. It's very difficult for any other player that doesn't have these financial means to counter that strong industry lobby. So it's definitely... It's not a very positive view, but I don't see this changing anytime soon. I think what we push to ensure there are initiatives around inclusive policy making, but what is that legislation on a European level, on a national level? It's designed, it's discussed with the biggest industry players, then it's done. And they say, okay, now everybody else can give their opinion about it. Then there's this internet consultation. People put in a lot of effort and time to give their opinion about legislation. And then they're like, great, thank you so much for all the input. We don't do anything, but we at least did inclusive policymaking, and now the legislation is finished. And I think that whole process of ensuring, and it's a long process, you have to keep pushing for not a seat at the table at the end when the legislation is already done, but really in the design process. And that means there's a lot of different things that you can do. So you need to ensure that policymakers have access to the right information. So it's not only about giving your opinion, but ensuring that you have research data and examples of practices where you can showcase, okay, this is what is not taking into account, and this is the reason why we should take it into account. Let's face it, we're not going to have enough financial means to have full-time lobbyists in Brussels ensuring that the voice of the smaller companies are being heard. They don't have time or money for that. But I do think that coming together, so also, for example, what we try to do with Collective Circular Textiles is really taking the knowledge that we have on policy making and advocacy. We just go to the producers, we just go to the Knitwits table, we ask them, what is your reality? What do you need? What kind of legislation do you need? And we take that information and ensure that they don't have to hire somebody that works on advocacy, but we can do it on their behalf.
Yeah.
So I also don't think that every single little company should have a seat at the table, because then we're not going to have efficient processes, but it's really about fair representation.
So if I understand it correctly, it's also by acting as a collective, you create this fair representation at the table, and that also takes away the pressure and the financial pressure on smaller teams that might not have the means to do so otherwise. Lonneke, you wanted to add a bit on this point.
Yeah, because there are so many things to take into account, and just thinking a bit more proactively, how can we manage that the ones who make the change are not the ones to have some say in it? And we see quite some development or innovation where the use of markers, so adding a pigment which is bio-certified to bring data. Because I think that is really key. If we have data, we can convince. Imagine, and that's very interesting, I'm going to mention the Textile Exchange Conference, all the booths that was about tracers and about trends of traceability systems. And that's, I think, something that really will help to get all of the smaller initiatives, the farms, all the smaller producers, to provide data in a way which is much more efficient. The data can then be used for verifying the origin. That's the thing, of course, when you're small and you want to leverage up your scale, that's actually the challenge. How do you ensure that you have trustworthy data? So I think this is really one of the benefits, that adding data, having means and innovations to collect data at all kind of levels is really going to help us, not to fight only for this place on the table. Super important you're there, but just also to leverage the input and power of these big brands who are doing the lobby. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to add as more of a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I really see this also as one of the benefits of how we can break the chain or find a solution.
There's also innovations that will be able to take away the pressure from supply chain actors in that circle.
Exactly.
Yeah. And maybe also to connect a bit more on that, how can those smaller pioneers and legislation authorities work together to relieve some of the financial pressure? And is there a dialogue that can be held between you and Stijntje in this example? Yeah.
Of course, and I think it all starts with dialogue. And there is so much happening, and it's connecting the dots. I think anyway in sustainability, and right now operating in sustainability, so many people with good ideas. The only thing is, how do we actually bring them together? I think you facilitating these kind of discussions is one of it. I would love to work together with both of you to see how we can do it. For us, bringing the legislation in is more your part. What we can do, for example, at Textile Exchange, for example, is one of the leveraging standard owners who is really bringing in. And I know the animal welfare team would be very happy to start up this discussion. We have somebody here in UK, because in UK you do have more of actually growers or farmers that do this dedicated for the wool. These kind of discussions we can absolutely bring up. And I know they will be happy for it, because we have to do it together.
That's good. Stijntje, you agree? Maybe you have some small additions from your side on how you think those dialogues can help.
I totally agree. We have to do it together. That's why we try to work together with whatever. So we always say, use what we have and what we grow, but that's not only about the materials, but also who's doing what, who already knows what, who can we support, how can they help us? So I think all steps are important, and it's very much about collaboration and to share ideas. And I agree also with the data that now we are making legislation from the current data, but we need new data also to change the system.
Certification of doing an audit requires actually to collect this data. Yeah. And that's the advantage. And I understand the pressure on the price, but with innovation, with these markers, doing desk audit, putting AI in place to actually collect and start working more on risk assessment or sampling-based auditing instead of yearly. There are all kind of opportunities that we can look into.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, quickly. And I think that's why it's interesting to have a collective Circular Textiles or Textile Exchange or also Fibershed, because then we can support all these different entrepreneurs and also do that on the advocacy. But it could also be interesting to see, because all wool initiatives have the same issue in Europe. How can we then maybe together say, how can we make data or do a certification? Not that one company needs to do it, but how could we do it like a group? In the States, they have the Fibershed. They made their own standard. Do we need to make our own standard, or could we link to another? We're on it. But
it needs time. And maybe it's also nice to tease a bit of a research project we're involved with, New Order of Fashion. As the next 2 years, we'll look at if we can make molecular imagery of wool fibers and trace it back to the sheep themselves and connect it in a product passport. But more on that in a few years. I think it's going to be really interesting work together with HVA and some textile innovators here in the country. We've discussed a lot of different elements that are part of changing the industry, and I do want to open up the stage for questions from the audience.
Hi, my name is Lennart. I do a lot with wool. I hear a lot about certification and wool not being certified, but what I would urge is look at the current existing certification, especially, for example, if you talk about biological farming. There is a lot of biological farming legislation. And I know that these people already have to adhere to a lot of rules, regulations, fill-in forms. It's a nightmare. So more regulation, I would say, support creating markets. And I know Fibershed is doing that a lot. And adhere to existing regulations. For example, SCAL is a very famous regulation. If you are SCAL, then you automatically adhere to certain fair farming regulation. That would help. So not more, but smarter.
And I agree, because the Material Matter Standard, also GOTS, the Global Organic Textile Standard, is allowing eligible certification for bio already.
I have two more questions that can either pull the conversation in a different direction or wrap it up maybe. You mentioned Higgs, and that was scrutinized a few years ago.
Certainly.
What happened there?
It's super hard to maintain a certain level. There is always a commercial need, because most actors that are certified don't do this because they're intrinsically driven to be sustainable. They do it because of the marketing effects. This means they always try to find ways around. And that we have, with the increasing pressure on having certifications to prove something, then you will have competition, other CBs, who are just saying, no matter what, just we will do the audit for a little money. We pretend if we be there, and then it's also okie dokie. And this is a super challenge, because if you put legislation in to have it verified by certification, again, not the holy grail, then immediately there is an interest of the market to grow, because we will live in a capital world. And then, so these are the challenges we have to look into. So again, I'm really into data, because data will dismiss loads of things. This is the matrix that we have to start building.
We need certifications and rules because we are in this capitalistic system driven by money and profits and not social, not equal, etc. With Fibershed, we try to build on trust and not on mistrust. I know it's utopia, but what if we all understand that we cannot go on like this, feel that it needs to change, and you will not do it wrong. I cannot go back anymore. Now I know what I know. And I worked for 25 years as a designer in fast fashion. I did shopping trips 4 times, 5 times a year, bought a lot of shit. Once you understand, you cannot go back. And I know we cannot get everybody on board. It would be good to just say, can we do from trust and from transparency and just work together? That's why the local supply chains are helping, because when you know each other, you don't need the certification, you just work together.
Thank you. I think that's a nice one to end on. Janine, maybe some final words. But what do you take away from this conversation, and where do you think we should go from here?
Yeah, I was planning to say the same. I think a lot of the things we talked about today are steps forward, but sometimes it's also necessary to zoom out and see what kind of efforts we are doing within the system as a whole. We are turning quite a lot of buttons, but we're not fundamentally changing the way that we produce and consume. Without that change, really focusing on prevention, also focusing on banning overstock, on banning the influx of endless, very low quality materials from outside of Europe entering the European market. If we don't change any of that, then we're gonna be stuck in the situation where we're just putting in a lot of effort to make small changes without ever getting to the point where we want to be, which is a circular textile industry.
The tipping point where circularity can compete.
Within the earth limits and in the social, like within the donut, right?
Yeah, donut economy, yeah. All right. Thank you so much for your contributions. Can I have a warm round of applause for my panelists? Lonneke de Kort, Stijntje Jaspers, Janine Roling. The final round of thanks to all of our partners that made this program possible, especially to AV Partner, who was able to help us out with a live stream, so we have not just the recordings, but can also have our international audience join in online that cannot make it here in Eindhoven. And that leaves me with thanking you very much for your attention, and have a lovely rest of the day here at Dutch Design Week.